What are the stories that you've been telling yourself, about what you can't do, who you are not, what you're too old for?
Hola! Welcome to Sana Sana podcast. I'm your host, Eileen Lopez Tomei. I'm a first-generation Cuban-American woman, breast cancer survivor, and mother of 5. I'm also a certified professional coach. Sana Sana is dedicated to you, Hispanic and Latina breast cancer survivors who've always been the strong ones and now feel lost in their identity after cancer diagnosis. Every week, I'll be sharing the foundation of my ecosystem of healing coaching process, which I use to help my clients restore trust in their bodies, release perfectionism, advocate for themselves, and live from a place of healing and peace rather than survival. Tune in to hear my real life experiences, carving a new path for myself after remission, but helping my coaching clients carve a new path for themselves too.
This morning, I was in my front yard in my polka dot pajamas, pulling weeds from my raised garden bed, and it's South Florida in August, and the rainy season has done what it does best, which is basically feed the weeds, and they've gotten out of control. And while I was pulling them with the help of my 13-year-old son, I was thinking about this episode, about what I wanted to say. And I realized this garden, 2 raised garden beds that I have that are waiting for October tomato and pepper and herb seedlings to be planted, is a story that I almost didn't let myself have. The truth is that most of us, or many of us, walk around with a collection of stories we tell about ourselves. Fixed beliefs, settled conclusions. I'm not good at this. I don't have this talent. I don't have the patience for that. That's not who I am. And I think for Latina survivors, especially women who have spent years performing a version of themselves for everyone else, for them, those stories can calcify. They can become hardened, and they become the walls of the box that others and we have put ourselves in. So this is something that survivorship gave me. 10 years of being alive after a diagnosis that could have ended differently. It gave me something that I didn't ask for and would not have chosen to need, of course. It gave me the urgency to examine those stories, the stories that I've told about myself, and to decide which ones were true and which ones I had simply been repeating so long that they felt true. And survivorship gave me permission to untell them. Hello, sister survivors. Welcome to episode 15 of Sana Sana. Today, I'm going to tell the story of 2 things that I grew in survivorship that had nothing to do with cancer and everything to do with who I am becoming. A garden and a business. Both started from seeds I almost didn't plant because I had told myself for too long that I couldn't grow things. And if you're a survivor who has been living inside a story about yourself that no longer fits, or maybe never fit, I'd love to help you examine it. Book a free discovery call at paperbell.me/Eileen Lopez Tomei. The link is always in the show notes. So I want to start with my abuela, my maternal abuela, Demetria Ventura. We called her Abuela Ventura. Not because this is her episode, but because every time I am in the garden, she's there too. So my maternal grandmother, as I've told you, was a breast cancer survivor. She was a woman one of many that I told you about in episode 2. In Cuba, she and my grandfather owned a piece of land. They grew fruit trees, grew sugarcane, managed the property and its yield. And my abuela had a green thumb and knew what to do with it. what to plant and how to grow it. And when she and my grandfather retired to Miami, to a townhouse not too far from where my sisters and parents and I lived, she brought her green thumb and her gardening with her. And I remember that she would spend hours every day in her garden, talking to her plants, talking to herself, usually complaining about my grandfather or the neighbors, but also pulling weeds, cursing the weeds. And I just remember watching her and kind of chuckling, but also loving how she would get lost in the outside and in her plants. And I don't remember that she grew any vegetables or fruit here in the United States, or at least not in her retirement home. She had flowers. She had other like native plants and bushes that she took really good care of. And it just was so comforting and amazing to watch a woman who had owned and tended to a farm for years to tend to this small piece of land that she had now. And also, when I think of this particular aspect of my grandmother and the stories around her green thumb and gardening and her land in Cuba, I also think about her sisters, all of them women who made things happen in their gardens, on their farms, in their marriages, for their children. All of them were survivors in one way or another, whether of cancer, like my grandmother, or of a bad marriage, or of exile. And then there's the story that I told myself. I kill plants. I don't have a green thumb. I don't have the patience or the talent. And I told myself these things, even though I've had and raised 5 children, which requires a lot of patience, maybe not a lot of talent, but I kept them alive. I would say that they thrived under my hand. And yet, here I was telling a story about how I would kill plants and I couldn't keep them alive. And for years and years, I carried this story, even as I watched my grandmother in her garden, even as I watched my mother, who also has a wonderful green thumb, bring dead orchids and other dead plants back to life. Even as I inherited, certain things from my grandmother, her, including her determination and her faith, I was telling myself this story, that somehow I didn't inherit her green thumb or my mother's green thumb, or so I believed. And I wish I could remember exactly what was the genesis of that story, where that story came from. Maybe when I first left home, had my own apartment with my husband at the time, I tried to bring in a plant and it didn't survive. I don't know specifically the moment where that story began. And it's something good to examine. Where do the stories that we tell ourselves come from? Especially if you can't, if you don't remember like the first time you told it or heard it being told about yourself, which, there are many stories about me, lots of lore, lots of Eileen lore in my family about, how I kill plants, how I'm not a great cook, which is not true, by the way. But I don't know. I think it was what made those things feel true was maybe that I had an example of a time where one of the first times I tried to cook a specific dish, it didn't turn out the way that my mom made it, which my mom is an excellent cook. Or maybe the first time I tried to tend to a house plant, it died. And that was the evidence that I repeated to myself over and over, that those stories were true. So a few years into survivorship, my cousin Edelman, who has the greenest thumb of all green thumbs, and he has a beautifully native landscaped home here in Miami, he started helping me and advising me and helping me to design and plant native trees and other plants around my house. I had really barely anything planted for the longest time, and I've got green patches on one side of the house and across the whole back of my house and part of the other backside of the house. And he just started taking me to farmers markets, or he's the one who introduced me to a cooperative a little bit further south from where I live, where they sold native plants, among other types of plants. And slowly, he would help me. He would come, he would help me dig up whatever it is that I did have in the backyard, plant something different. And some of them made it, some of them didn't. But for the most part, I kept all those plants that he planted and sometimes that we planted together alive. And so about 3 years ago, I decided that I was going to build a raised garden bed and grow my own vegetables and herbs with his encouragement and his help. And about a year into that adventure, that experiment, a colleague and friend from work who grows vegetables and herbs in raised beds and also has a scary good green thumb. He lives in Texas with his family. He inspired me to keep going with my raised garden, to be more courageous in what I chose to grow, and to not sweat it when some plants didn't do what I thought they should or would, like bear fruit or vegetables. So I had these 2 raised beds, one larger, one smaller, and the smaller one was on legs. The larger raised bed was closer to the ground, like a container, a large container. And in the smaller of the 2, I grew herbs of all sorts, basil, rosemary, which is my favorite, Cuban oregano, a number of herbs. And in the larger raised bed, I knew I wanted to try my hand at growing tomatoes, which I think are already notoriously hard to grow, and especially in South Florida because of the pests and the heat. So with the help of the people at the cooperative that I just mentioned, I decided to try my hand at planting some tidy treat tomatoes. So they're like little cherry tomatoes, like the ones that you see at the grocery store. And then I also decided to try and plant different varieties of peppers, including Thai chilies, the specific type of green pepper, like I said, herbs, lettuce, bok choy, eggplants, carrots, and I prepared the soil, I planted the seedlings, I fertilized and watered and watched. And then I will never forget the first time that I planted in my own raised garden, and my tidy treat tomato plants, which I had like 4 or 5, started to bear fruit. These first little green, tiny little green, round green baby tomatoes. And it was just amazing that something that I had planted, tended, cared for, yielded. And I began to untell myself the story of how I killed plants and green things, and rewrote the script into me having a green thumb. I can't tell you what that moment when I saw the first tomatoes forming on the vine felt like. It wasn't the harvest yet. It was just the first sign of fruit. And it may seem ridiculous to say this, but it was this pride that just swelled up inside of me. And I hadn't even gotten them to full ripeness yet, but it was just amazing to see that they'd grown from these little seedlings into these really tall plants that were now yielding these tiny little tomatoes. And then I remember feeling her. I felt my grandmother and her sisters and my mother, who are all women that made things happen, whether in their gardens or on their farms or in their marriages, in their families, for their children, in their communities. And I felt their strength and creative energy flow through me. So this is the 3rd fall that I will plant. I plant tidy treat tomatoes every fall. Probably plant peppers again, and a variety of different peppers. I just named a couple, but I've planted a whole variety of peppers, herbs. And last fall, or maybe it was in the spring. I can't remember now exactly when you plant strawberries, but I tried my hand at strawberries and I got a whole yield of delicious strawberries as well. And in the summer, I rest the soil. For me, at least, it's hard to grow anything in South Florida in the summer heat except weeds. And so a vegetable garden requires attention no matter the season. Pest management, weeding, fertilizing, watering. And that can seem overwhelming. And you can start to tell yourself stories like I did, even when you see success or some small early signs of success. There's like a certain way that you're supposed to plant plants in a certain distance apart, and like this, I bought this square tool so that I can make like a grid and plant my plants in a grid-like form, but that all got really overwhelming. My perfectionism started to really creep in. And so I just decided to garden just the way that my mind works. And I brought that self-awareness to it, so I plant and I garden a little chaotically, not very methodically, especially when it comes to planting. I do try to plant things in a certain way so that the taller plants don't give shade to the shorter plants and all of that. But I really stopped kind of trying to do the perfect spacing and figure all of that out. And so for me, it's just, I love being outside. I love being in the dirt. I love planting and seeing new life come up from the ground. And I garden, again, like the way that my brain works. Let's call it creatively. And that's exactly right for me. I also forgot to mention that before I ever had a raised bed or had some beautiful natives growing around my back and my front yard, I planted a mango tree. Again, my cousin Edelman took me to a market or like a weekend event where there were vendors of all sorts selling native plants. And I got a mango tree. It was like a foot tall at a time in a pot, maybe 2 feet tall. And I brought it home. I found a spot for it in my backyard and I planted it right. There was nothing there but manicured lawn at the time. And I just planted it right in the middle between the house and the fence that butts up against my backyard neighbor. And now it's as tall as the house, and it just gave us, around June, it gave us its second yield of delicious mangoes.
Hi, I'm a 10-year breast cancer survivor. And when I was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer, I hadn't had a mammogram in 4 years. I thought I could wait. I couldn't. For Latina and Hispanic women, breast cancer is the leading cause of cancer death, and we're often diagnosed later when it's harder to treat. But early detection changes everything. Today, the guidance is simple. Start mammograms at 40 and don't skip them. And while self-exams aren't a replacement, knowing your body helps you catch changes sooner. So if you've been putting it off, this is your sign. Schedule the mammogram. Know your body. Advocate for yourself, because your life is worth that appointment.
I think kind of the beginning of the wake-up call, or the beginning of like examining the story I had been telling myself about my green thumb or lack of a green thumb, which is that something that I planted, that I cared for, and I had to fertilize it with certain fertilizer that was good for fruit trees, water it, especially at the beginning, make sure that it had enough, peel the grass away so that I mulched it, and made sure that it had enough composted soil and all the nutrients that it needed to grow. So something that I planted and cared for and tended and waited on is now tall enough to shade my yard and feed my family and neighbors and friends delicious mangoes. And that's mine. I also want to mention, because I've already alluded to it 2 times, the Little River Cooperative in Homestead. It's a cooperative farm. They grow, all kinds of wonderful plants and native flowers and native avocado trees, and they also grow seedlings primarily of foods like edible, like tomatoes and peppers and lettuces and herbs of all sorts. And I found them through my cousin. When I decided that I wanted to have a raised garden bed, I took a class, like a course on how to do that, how to raise vegetables and herbs in South Florida. And I also volunteered there for 2 or 3 years now in a row. I volunteer by helping them transfer seedlings that they grow in these multiple, one size containers, transfer them out of each of their little squares into individual pots, small pots, to help them, the cooperative, get ready for their beginning of the October planting season sale. And I also help them when I volunteer to pot. They have this special mix, this special dirt mix for gardeners across South Florida. It's wonderful. Dirt, it's all organic. And I help them pot that also for sale. And I love spending a day, sometimes 2 days, sweating and learning and laughing with other gardeners and community members. And for me, I thought of this earlier. It's almost like servium in the soil. Remember my tattoo that says servium, which is I will serve. I'm serving the cooperative. I'm serving the community. I'm serving the environment. And also I'm feeding my own joy. It helps me to get out of my head, where my husband says I have a very rich inner life, and he's not wrong. So being in the garden helps me to get out of my head. It helps me to quiet my mind. It helps me to be still, even though I'm planting and weeding and watering and fertilizing. So I'm not sitting still, but I'm also not going from one thing to a different thing. I am very present in the garden. I'm very present to my thoughts, to my plants, to nature. And for me, time moves very slowly when I'm outside with my garden. And I've always loved being outside, except for in the extreme heat that we're experiencing in South Florida. But that notwithstanding, I've always loved to be outside. And this is when people would say like, oh, they love to hike, or they love to, when you think about being an outdoor person, there are very specific activities that you think about. And I certainly enjoy those as well. But all of the benefits that you hear about receiving from being in nature and being outside, I feel like I get just from being in my little vegetable garden, my one big raised bed and my smaller raised bed where I grow herbs. It's an amazing feeling. And if I'm going to be honest, it really, it's not that it bothers me, but it does make me sad to think that it took me this long to find this and to examine the story I had been telling myself about my green thumb or lack thereof, and to retell that story. I'm 56 years old, and I've been telling myself the story that I'm a plant killer for decades. And I don't look at that as a failure. That's just what happens when the stories that we carry go unexamined. And survivorship was the thing that finally made me look at those stories. The work of examining the stories we carry about ourselves and deciding which ones we want to keep, that is some of the most meaningful work I do with survivors. And I'm going to pause here for just a second, because if what we've been talking about is landing for you, I want you to know there's somewhere that you can take it. If you're a cancer survivor who's always been the strong one, and you're quietly wondering who you are now that everything has changed, you don't have to figure that out alone. I'm a cancer survivorship coach and a fellow survivor, and my coaching practice exists for women exactly like you. If today's episode is resonating and you're ready to go deeper, book a free discovery call at paperbell.me/Eileen Lopez Tomei. The link is in the show notes. Okay, now, the second garden, the one I built starting in December 2025 to January of 2026. There's another story that I have been telling myself for years. I've been in public service for almost 27 years. Before that, I worked as an attorney in several nonprofits. And whenever I thought about starting a business of my own, which by the way was a dream that my father had, and maybe in a future episode I'll tell you that story as well and how it helped to inspire me. But for today, the story that I told myself was, I've never had a business. I've never had to charge anyone for my services. I've always either been a federal government employee or I worked at a nonprofit representing clients that we didn't charge for attorney services. How would someone like me know how to start or run a business? And when I became a certified coach, this story popped up again because I tried briefly to establish a practice and then I stopped. I retreated into the safety of being an in-house coach within my agency. And it's not an extra job that I get paid for. I joined a cadre that we have in my agency of certified professional coaches, other colleagues, and provide coaching services to employees who sign up through this particular coaching program that we have. So I retreated to the relative safety of that. I will coach and I won't have to charge anybody any money and I won't have to have a business, which I already tried and I couldn't do it because I told myself, I don't know how to charge people for my services and I don't know how to do it without it feeling wrong or gross. And I think what was underneath that thought of which was the primary thought for me, how am I going to charge people? I remember even when I was a nonprofit attorney or after I left, the nonprofit sector and went to work in the federal government, thinking, how could I possibly charge people to represent them, to advocate for them, right? So this is a story that has been rumbling around in my head for a while. And so what was underneath that? I think part of it may have been cultural, maybe gender related. Was it about worth, maybe self-worth? Maybe, I'm not sure. I haven't examined, this story too deeply yet. But yeah, I think it is also tied up in being a public servant for so long that money just felt like a betrayal of, charging money felt like a betrayal of a value, of this value I have of service. And then in December 2025, I'm looking out across 2026 and I remember I'm thinking, wow, this is going to be the 10-year anniversary of my diagnosis. We're coming up upon it in August this month. And I'm contemplating 2026 and what it means to have survived 10 years since my diagnosis. And that's when I decided this is going to be the year that I start my own business, that I establish a coaching practice as a cancer survivorship coach, which was always my intention. Even when I went to my coaching school and became a certified professional coach, I wanted to coach other survivors like me. And I think I've mentioned this in past episodes. For me, it was paying forward the coaching that had helped me get through survivorship. And I remember thinking, I'm going to learn how to use social media to market my services. Here was 55 years old at the time. I'm an elder Gen X. I'm figuring it out. I'm going to figure it out. And I also told myself at the end of last year that I would finally start a podcast about survivorship for survivors like me, Latina, first gen, eldest daughter, the strong one. And so I was determined I would stand up a business, learn how to sell, learn to charge for my services, and I would not let perfectionism or the story that I told myself about what an entrepreneur looked like, which was not like me, to get in the way, especially since it was my intention to serve the survivor community. And so you may be thinking, what's the connection between these two stories, the story of how I came to gardening and how I I rewrote the script that I had been putting out there for years that I didn't have a green thumb, and then the story about how I wasn't an entrepreneur, how I couldn't charge for my services. The garden and the business are really the same story told in two different soils. In both cases, I prepared the ground, I did the work, and waited to see if something would grow. And in both cases, something grew, as in my garden, or in the case of my survivorship coaching practice, is growing. This podcast is growing my coaching practice. My mango tree, which is now as tall as my house. My tidy treat tomatoes bearing fruit. I've grown and I'm growing all of that. And again, I know that it took a cancer diagnosis and almost 10 years of survivorship to get me here. And I would not have chosen to need that kind of permission, to have to go through cancer to get to where I am now. Nobody would choose that. And yet here I am, growing things that I almost convinced myself I couldn't grow. What I would say to my sister survivors out there, it's not advice, it's something altogether different. It's permission. And you don't have to have had cancer to have been living inside a story about yourself that was never fully true. But if you have had cancer, and if you are a survivor, you've already been through something that strips away the things that are not essential. And sometimes in that stripping away, the untrue stories become visible for the first time. And I want to ask you here, what is the story that you, my listener, my sister survivors, have been telling about yourself? What are the stories that you've been telling yourself, about what you can't do, who you are not, what you're too old for, what an entrepreneur or an artist or a gardener or a leader does or doesn't look like, about what survivorship means, and about who you are as a survivor? I gave myself permission, and I would give all of my sister survivors permission, and want to do that right now, to examine the stories and beliefs that you have about yourselves and challenge them. Rewrite them. Give yourself the freedom to decide and discern whether that is the thought, the narrative, the story, the script that you want to continue to have and that you want to continue to tell about your one precious life. And you don't untell a story by deciding it's wrong. You untell it by trying the thing that you've told yourself you're not good at, or you'd never be good at, or you don't have a talent for, or you don't have the courage for, or whatever. You untell it by trying that thing and seeing what happens. You plant the tomatoes, you start the business, you show up to the cooperative, and among a group of happy experts, you get your hands in the dirt. And sometimes the thing you planted grows. So I want to close this story circle by going back to my abuela. She grew things on a farm in Cuba. She grew things in a Miami townhouse garden. She was in both places, talking to her plants, cursing the weeds, making things grow. And I thought for decades that I had not inherited that. And I was wrong. And now I wonder sometimes if someday I will own a modest piece of land, maybe a chicken coop, more fruit trees, a bigger vegetable garden, kind of like the land that my grandparents had in Cuba, the kind of place where my grandmother tended and loved the soil. I wonder sometimes if that's mine to have too, and I think maybe it is. And maybe the legacy that I leave my kids and grandkids is not just the mango tree in the backyard, but the proof that their mother, their abuela, years after being told she had cancer, planted things and watched them grow. Sana, sana, colita de rana. Si no sanas hoy, sanarás mañana. There is still time to grow things, hermana. Whatever you've been wanting to plant and waiting to plant, plant it. Hazlo. Hasta la próxima vez. Sana, sana. If this episode stirred something about a story you've been ready to untell, share it with a survivor who might be ready to hear it. Also subscribe, follow wherever you're listening, and leave a review. It helps more survivors to find the show. And if you're ready to start examining those stories that you've been telling yourself about yourself, come find me. Book a free discovery call at paperbell.me/Eileen Lopez Tomei. I'd love to be in the room when you plant something new. See you next week. Sana sana.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Sana Sana, the show that helps you heal and restore the parts of your ecosystem that were depleted after a breast cancer diagnosis. If you liked the episode, please leave us a rating and review so we can reach more incredible survivors como tú who want to heal with us. If you want to stay connected with our growing community, check out our Instagram at Eileen Lopez Tomei Coach and share what part of the episode touched your heart today. See you next week.